Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I am Adriana Esquivel-Milbert from the University of Birmingham and one of the organizers of the International Tree Mortality Network. And I'm very pleased to host the 13th webinar of the International Tree Mortality Network today with Professor David Galbraith from the University of Leeds. This webinar series is organized by the International Tree Mortality Network in partnership with the IUFRO. And for those who are not familiar with the International Tree Mortality Network, our aim is to join people from different backgrounds to try to understand the trends in tree mortality globally. And this webinar series is one of our activities. So if you are interested, please look at our website, it's here, and join us as well. So before we start, some practical informations. First, if you want to ask questions, please use the Q&A function on the right side of your screen in the bottom. And you can ask questions during the entire webinar. So you don't need to wait until the end. You can just ask questions during the webinar as well. And you can use the chat to introduce yourself and tell us where you come from, where you were watching us from. And don't use the Q&A, don't use the chat for questions, use the Q&A function. So with that, I would like to introduce David Galbraith, who is a professor of terrestrial ecosystem science in the School of Geography in the University of Leeds, UK. Professor Galbraith is from the Amazon, was born in the heart of the Amazon and grew up there. And he holds a PhD from the School of Geosciences in the University of Edinburgh. And he did a postdoc after that in the Environmental Change Institute in the University of Oxford. And shortly after that, he joined the University of Leeds as a lecturer. And he holds a professorship now in the University of Leeds. I had the great honor to work with David during my time in the University of Leeds. And I could witness his group growing very fast. And David's a very inspiring figure, a great mentor, and very committed towards the next generation of tropical ecologists. Within his time in Leeds, he has mentored many early career researchers, many of those from the tropics, including people from India, Guyana, and Brazil. David also holds a position at the State University of Mato Grosso, UNEMAT, where together with colleagues from there and from the University of Leeds, he leads research on the climate sensitivity of Amazonian trees. So with that, the floor is yours, David. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Adriani, for that introduction. Thank you. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully you can all see now. Can you confirm that? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks.
So yeah, I think first thing to say is thank you for having me here. I find this a great forum. It's a wonderful initiative, and the talks are always very stimulating. And thank you for inviting me. I'll be saying a few words about the climate sensitivity of Amazon forests and what we know from integration of a range of different approaches. I've taken the liberty to slightly change the title here, and I've gone for a more, perhaps one that's a bit less certain, which is towards a better understanding of climate sensitivity of Amazon forests. And the reason for that really is that I think there are still many more questions than there are answers when we start thinking about the sensitivity of Amazon forests. The other thing to say at this point is that this is very much a team effort, and Adriani, who was a very important part of the team of people whose work I'll be presenting here. A lot of the work that I will be presenting today is co-led with my colleague Emmanuel Glor. But the hard work, the really important work of actually doing everything, collecting the field data, doing the analysis, that's all been done by this wonderful team of postdoctoral researchers and PhD students, both at the University of Leeds and in Unimachi as well, in Mato Grosso. So thank you. So moving on then. So a little bit about the outline to the talk. As this is quite an eclectic audience, it's probably a mixture of people who work in the Amazon and those with a more general interest in forest mortality, tree mortality. I'll start off slowly and introduce the topic. I think it's important to set the context before discussing how climate sensitivity across the Amazon might vary. I think it's important to understand what the key spatial gradients are that might determine that variation. So I'll discuss those in a little bit, and then move on to what we've learned and what we think we know about the sensitivity of Amazon forest to climate, and conclude with some notes on what I think are good directions going forward. So the Amazon, then, for those of you who work in the Amazon, I don't even need to tell you how important the Amazon is, but I think for context, the Amazon is really a giant in the Earth system, and one of the best graphical representations, I think, of this is this figure here by Henning and Mali, which really plots the land surface resized to its GPP contribution. This is all aggregated over the course of a year. And you can see very clearly the prominent role of the tropics in global GPP, but especially of the Amazon. And it's not just GPP. The Amazon is a giant in terms of almost every other ecosystem service you can think of, from biodiversity provision to biomass storage, approximately 100 billion tons of carbon in its vegetation alone, when you consider the above ground and below ground compartments. Massive contributor to the global land sink, although that contribution has been declining in recent decades. And also home, and we shouldn't forget this, to large numbers of human populations that depend on forests for their livelihoods. Those include about 350 different indigenous groups. So it's therefore important that we understand the sensitivity of Amazon forests to global stressors, and the climate services, the ecosystem services that the forests provide are, of course, threatened by deforestation and climate change. Very nice paper from Luciana Gatti in Nature last year summarizes this. So this is based on atmospheric CO2 profiles with aircraft. These profiles in strategic parts of the basin, different parts of the basin, that integrate over very large footprints. And these are flights that have been going on for the best part of a decade. So there's a decade's worth of data here. And very interesting outcomes to all of this. From this, one can derive net fluxes over the basin. This includes not just what intact forests are doing, but also the land use component as well. And what's very clear is that even over this the time frame of the study here, some parts of the Amazon, some regions of the Amazon, especially the southeastern region here denoted by ALF, are already acting as consistent sources of carbon to the atmosphere. And the way that this is partitioned, you have a net flux, which is in blue, a fire flux in red, and the difference there is the vegetation flux in green. And if it's negative, that vegetation is acting as a sink. If it's positive, it's acting as a source. And in some parts of the Amazon, that source behavior is already very evident and sustained. So my own entry point into all of this, this is going back to my PhD days, and the motivating factor for me at the time was this result of Amazon forest dieback as simulated by global vegetation models. It was first reported in the late 90s by Andrew Friend's group. At the time, he ran the hybrid model. And in those simulations, in a very warm and dry future, this is run with the Hadley Center model scenarios, HADCM2 at the time, the result was that climate would change so much, it becomes so dry and so hot that the forests would effectively be replaced with a savanna-like vegetation or desertify in some cases. And trying to understand that result was really at the heart of what I was trying to do in my PhD. So I spent a lot of my time in my PhD trying to understand from a model perspective, from a global model perspective, what the main drivers of this loss of biomass were over the Amazon forests in the future, and also which regions, which parts of the Amazon were most at risk. So some of the things that emerged back then, if you do separate analysis where you only vary precipitation or temperature or relative humidity, and you do that in a factorial way, was that temperature emerged as the biggest driver of the dieback of the forest in those models, across the 3 models I was looking at anyway. Well, fast forward 12 years or so, and that question of Amazon dieback, it's still there. And it's still addressed with each iteration of the IPCC climate models. There are studies that look at the risk of dieback to the Amazon forest. And that question of which forests are most at risk, that's still very, very relevant. This is the latest incarnation. This is a recent paper by Parry et al. This is using a new generation of Earth system models this time, not offline models as I was using, that have a host of things now that weren't in the models of the past, interactive fire schemes, for example. And we can still see that across models, the different models suggest risk is greater in different places. If we look at 3 of those models here, there's a suggestion at least that the Northeast Amazon is most at risk. Another model, it's more the Western Amazon, and another model, it's more scattered. So there's still pressing questions, both from a modeling perspective, but also from a data perspective about which forests in the Amazon are most at risk. And over time, my focus has shifted more from the model perspective to the data perspective. My group has tried to look for insights from different strands of data to answer that question. So how do we then think about which forests are most at risk? What kinds of things should we consider here? And in the end, the impacts or the risk to an ecosystem through climate change are a function of both the exposure of that ecosystem to a climate stress, change in temperature or rainfall, for example, but also the sensitivity of the system to that change in climate stressor. And that sensitivity can be modulated by a number of ecosystem properties, as includes soils, but most crucially, the composition of the forests themselves and the functional properties of those forests, the functional traits that define how they respond to climate. Ultimately, adaptive capacity also plays a part. Given a climate stress or a change, how are our species able to adapt to a climate stressor? So the important thing to think about is, we talk about, if we want to understand these risks on a spatial scale, we want to understand differences across different Amazon forests in climate risk. It's important to just think of what to expect, I guess, first, given the information we have on how Amazon forests vary across space. And I hope from the next series of slides, the message that emerges is that Amazon forests exhibit a lot of spatial variation, both with respect to the climate space they're found on, but also to their ecosystem dynamics as well. So if we start with climate, we think that in terms of rainfall, the main gradient is really this one here from northwest, high rainfall in the northwest, towards less rainfall in the southeast of the basin. So you have areas, this is just shown for Brazil, but into Peru and beyond, and in northwestern Brazil, very high rainfall. Actually, there's not a month there where there really is any water stress detectable. To systems in the southeast of the basin that are really quite water stressed and go through up to 5 or 6 months of a dry season. If we look at temperature, there's much less of a gradient, but there still are interesting features that emerge from here. And this is a map that Rakesh Tiwari, former PhD student, put together. And this is a map of the mean daily maximum temperature of the warmest month. You can see that in the southeastern part of the Amazon here as well, that's also the region of the Amazon where it gets warmest, where one is the forests there are exposed to the highest temperatures. So one thing is the base climate and the background climate space that these forests occupy, and another thing is the trends that they've been experiencing over time. And there's actually an awful lot of consistency in both of those things. If we look at rainfall signatures over the Amazon, these are interpolated based on weather station data. And we can see that there's different metrics we can use here. The one that's shown here is the number of dry days and how that's been changing over time. We can see that the changes have really been, those trends in dryness have really been most accentuated at the southern edges of the basin as well. So region F here, for example, we zoom in there in the southeast Amazon, see that there's really a marked trend there over time in the number of dry days. If we look at land surface temperatures, so another important stressor of ecophysiology and ecological processes, we see again that those trends in land surface temperatures are most pronounced there in the southern part of the Amazon basin. It's not just trends in means, but in extremes as well. This is a figure from one of our study plots that clearly show a marked change over time in the maximum temperatures that some of these forests experience. So over a 20-year period, there are substantial shifts. So we now have a much higher number of days where forests in this space of the Amazon experience air temperatures that exceed 40 degrees. It's not just climate, soils also vary and play a role. So it's a well-documented gradient. This is work of Beto Quezada back in 2012, great paper that documents how soil fertility and soil structure varies across the basin. And the pattern there really is one of fertile soils in the western part of the basin closest to the Andes, and much more weathered and older infertile soils as one goes towards the east and the center and the east of the basin. There's also variation in structure of soils too. This is a soil structural index that's shown here that aggregates a number of different structural elements of the soil. So strong differences in climate, strong gradients in soil properties as well. And those translate into differences in dynamics, in carbon storage and dynamics. So one way of grouping the Amazon is to use these broad biogeographical domains that take account of the geology of the basin. If we take the Western Amazon in orange here, for example, the biomass is biomass storage there is lower than in the Central Eastern Amazon, and definitely lower than the Guyana Shield. There's patterns here of gradients in biomass storage, highest biomass storage in Guyana Shield and East Central Amazon, and less in the Western Amazon and in the Brazilian Shield. And those are associated with differences in turnover, very low turnover in Guyanas and East Central Amazon, much higher turnover in the Western Amazon and in the Brazilian Shield. So very different types of forests, fast, productive forests in the West generally, slower, less productive forests in the east central Amazon. Guyana Shield seems to have forests with high woody productivity and low turnover, and that's what gives it that exceptionally high biomass. Also, variation in species composition. So, and you might expect that species are adapted to the climate space in which they occupy. The highest species richness is in the wet parts of the Amazon, with lower species richness as one goes towards those drier fringes. A clear sign there that climate acts as an important biogeographical filter, perhaps. Some large numbers of species associated with wetter areas, fewer numbers of species associated with drier areas. But also gradients in composition. So nitrogen fixers, much more common in the northern part of the Amazon, for example, than in other parts. Gradients in wood density, forests in the west, those faster, more productive forests, lower wood density than those towards the center and the east of the Amazon. So all sorts of spatial variation there in that might lead us to hypothesize about how different Amazon forests might vary in their sensitivity or vulnerability to climate. There's a few things that we might consider. We might consider, for example, that those forests in dry, warm areas are well adapted to those climates and thus less sensitive to water stress, high temperatures, than those in wetter, cooler areas. If we look at meta-analysis, for example, of vulnerability or embolism resistance, the Chota et al. Meta-analysis 2012, for example, it's very clear that there's a clear relation there between embolism resistance and background water availability. Those species found in areas with less water availability are generally more resistant to embolism. A second hypothesis, we might hypothesize based on the difference in availability of resources. There's a very nice paper from Rafael Oliveira, Tansley review from a year or so ago, where Rafael presents this very nice framework linking growth to hydraulic risks. Species with higher growth rates, perhaps on more fertile soils, take more hydraulic risks and might be more vulnerable to drought, for example, than slow-growing species on less fertile places. Finally, we might expect that despite being more adaptive, that the most vulnerable forests might be those in ecotonal regions at biome limits. That's where the climate stress is most severe, as we've shown in the previous maps. That's where the data suggests that exposure to stress is the greatest in the Amazon. So how do we go about looking at these things and thinking about things? What tools do we have available that help us to address some of these questions? And there's obviously a large number of approaches, and I imagine that many people who are in the audience today, and definitely the panelists who are hosting me, have employ a very large number of approaches to answer questions of climate sensitivity, and those range across a range of scales, which vary both in the level of mechanistic detail they provide, but also the spatial coverage they provide. So it might include, on the one hand, detailed ecophysiological measurements of traits associated with climate sensitivity. Those might be xylem vulnerability curves, those might be temperature response curves for photosynthesis, those might be concentrations of non-structural carbohydrates in various tissues. But we can also approach this from an ecosystem experiment perspective, from examination of forest inventory plots, from remote sensing, or from intense high-frequency measurements. And I'll be reviewing a few of those different approaches and what they've yielded to us now. So I'll move on now to the insights that we've gleaned from permanent plots. So thinking about what have we learned, and thinking about permanent plots, remote sensing, ecophysiological approaches, and a little bit of modeling at the end as well. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of what we know about the Amazon is really through the seminal efforts of forest plots networks distributed across not just the Amazon, but also Africa and Asia, and tropics more generally. Incredible efforts. Forestplots.net here is one of the main ones, and it consists really of hundreds of collaborators and researchers who dedicate incredible hours of their lives to monitoring changes in trees over time, how they're growing, changing diameter, patterns of mortality, low-tech measurements, but which need to be done precisely, of diameter change over time, for example. And forestplots.net has provided those insights. Hundreds of collaborators across the tropics, hundreds of hours of people time in going to these very remote places to collect this unbelievable data. And for this part of the talk, I'd like to focus on mortality, which is really the focus of this group. And the first results I'd like to show here are results from work by Adriani as part of her postdoc a couple of years ago. And what Adriani did here was to analyze mortality data from about 200 plots or 190 plots or something like that across the Amazon. I think it was over 100,000 trees, 120,000 if I'm not mistaken. And it was perhaps the most comprehensive analysis of tropical tree mortality to date. And she specifically looked at the risk factors that led to the mortality of individual trees, so species and individual level risk factors. But she also looked at some plot level metrics as well. So this is the resulting map from the study, and what can be seen from that is now with a much larger number of data points, especially in the southeastern Amazon, that mortality rates in those southeastern Amazon forests and southern Amazon forests, Brazilian shield forests, they're amongst the highest in the basin. In the northern parts of the basin, East Central, they're quite low. What Adriani also looked at was mode of death, how trees die. And quite surprisingly, one of the outcomes of this work, that there wasn't such a big difference across regions in terms of the percentage of trees that died standing versus being broken or uprooted. There was a signature there in the East Central Amazon that more trees died standing than in other regions, but across more dynamic areas, such as the West, and less dynamic areas, such as the Guyana Shield, there wasn't really a big difference in mode of death. However, the interesting factors that emerged from that, I think, were from her individual level analysis. So this is survival analysis. And in those survival models, Adriani has built in predictors, species level predictors, such as the maximum growth rate, the mean growth rate of different species. She's also built in the wood density of different species, for example, in there as a predictor. And something that's called the water deficit affiliation. This is a direct index of sensitivity to climate in a way, because it represents how affiliated a species is with a dry or a wet space, whether it's found predominantly in a wet or predominantly in a dry space. And the more negative this number is, the more dry affiliated it is. The results were very interesting. What she found across all of this is that both species level and individual level factors matter. Species level growth rate emerged as really the most important predictor in this analysis. And interestingly, the metric that she used as being perhaps most directly related to climate, which was species water deficit affiliation, only emerged as a significant predictor of death in the southern Amazon. And there was a clear sign that the more wet affiliated species faced a greater mortality risk than the more dry affiliated species. So what about at the plot scale? What do we know then about climate mortality relationships in Amazonia at the plot scale? And this is a figure from Martin Sullivan from his science paper in 2020. And these depict bivariate relationships between precipitation in the driest quarter and the carbon residence time, defined here really as the biomass stocks divided by the mean annual biomass losses in these systems. Each different color represents a different region. The South American forests, which include the Amazon, represented in green here. And it's clear that when you look at it in terms of just these overall bivariate relationships, both with precipitation and with temperature, there isn't really a clear pattern of a strong climate influence, at least on background residence times, turnover times across space. However, if you zoom in a little bit more closely to the southern Amazon, different signals start to emerge. And this was a great paper by Simoni Hayes, who's based in Unemachi. And fantastic paper, includes all sorts of interesting aspects, including the risk of death associated with liana infestation, for example, in there as well. But what Simoni did was she analyzed dynamics data from forests specifically located in this fringe region of the Amazon. We're talking about the extremes of Amazonia here. And so there is still a gradient here from wetter forests up here to mainly drier forests. But when you look at this region, this drier fringe, and we look at the relationships between mortality and precipitation in this region, a clear pattern does emerge, such that in this dry fringe of the Amazon, clearly there's a strong climate signal on mortality there. Mortality is greater when precipitation is lower. So in summary, maybe I'll go back there. In summary, from this forest inventory analysis, I guess what the messages seem to be is that if we're looking for a climate signature, at least in mortality in these regions, those emerge quite strongly in the south of the Amazon, both through Adriani's risk factor analysis, this analysis of Simoni here, but perhaps there's less evidence for a direct role of climate in shaping those spatial patterns of mortality in other regions of the basin. No, we're not talking about change in mortality here. We're talking about mean mortality rates and how those vary across space. Okay, so moving on then, we can also approach this question of sensitivity to climate via remote sensing. And we don't really have good mortality data from remote sensing, so we choose a different metric here. And that is important. We're thinking about a different process. We're not thinking about mortality anymore. And this is some work done by Max Fancourt. It's in a review at the moment. And this is what Max did, is he analyzed responses to the 2015-2016 El Nino event using solar-induced fluorescence data, SIF data. And SIF has been shown to be a pretty good proxy for GPP and a much more direct proxy for photosynthesis than NDVI, for example. So what Max did is he focused on the anomalies in SIF as a response to that El Nino event, examined those across different regions of the Amazon, but was also interested in understanding what drove those anomalies and responses. So he was interested specifically in the role of the magnitude of the stressor itself, so the change, the anomaly in temperature and precipitation associated with the event in relation to the background climate and soil properties of the system. So he overlaid those anomalies, those SIF anomalies, with a large number of other gridded products that included information, background climate space, but also soil properties, including water table depth and carbon exchange capacity too. And what he found was quite interesting. What he found was that the strength of the anomaly itself associated with the change in precipitation and the temperature didn't really explain much of the anomalies in SIF across space. In fact, it was only 2% or something like that. what emerged as the more important controls on those anomalies were other factors, especially the precipitation of seasonality. So forests associated with more seasonal spaces here were more resilient than forests associated in terms of their SIF responses than forests associated with less seasonal spaces. Forests on more fertile sites also exhibited were less impacted by the drought anomaly in terms of their SIF responses than those on less fertile sites. So the net result here is that the background climate and the soils, they explained a lot more of that response to the ENSO than the magnitude of the stressor itself. And that is likely associated to changes or differences in the sensitivity of forests across space. So what Max looked at was the sensitivity, so the change in SIF, the anomaly in SIF as a function of the anomaly in climate, either in precipitation or temperature during that event, and found very large differences across regions. So in the southern Amazon, the forests in the southern Amazon are much less sensitive in terms of their SIF to precipitation than those further north, but also other interesting differences. So if we just take those in the more northern parts of the Amazon, northwestern Amazon forests, overall, the most sensitive to those anomalies, precipitation anomalies, and markedly more sensitive than those in the east central Amazon. So there seems to be a case arising here that Western Amazon forests, based on this analysis, more sensitive to precipitation change than those in the east. Differences in temperature sensitivity were much less pronounced. So then, moving on to insights from ecophysiological measurements, I think for this particular group, we don't really need to go into detail about xylem vulnerability curves or non-structural carbohydrates, but when we think about plant trait measurements, I think there's a number of specific traits that are more directly related to climate stress than others. And we know, for example, now there's been ample work on this, probably by many people who are listening to this talk, that embolism resistance is an important predictor of drought-induced mortality. Typically, that's taken to be Psi 50, the xylem water potential associated with a 50% loss of conductivity. There's also evidence that, at least in many cases, perhaps not always, drought-induced mortality is also associated with a depletion of non-structural carbohydrates, which have a number of important roles, metabolic roles, including osmoregulation, for example, and are important for maintaining key functions during drought periods. In terms of temperature, it's a bit less clear. I think there's less clear evidence here that the thermal traits we have at our disposal and that are being examined, they really have a strong impact at the individual level, but a commonly used metric is something we call T50. And so this is derived from these thermotolerance curves. So this is based on the quantum yield of photosystem 2. So this is a light harvesting component of the photosynthetic apparatus. So that's this FV over FM term here. And what we're interested in is how that quantum yield declines with progressively increasing temperatures. One can heat leaf segments to different temperatures, plot how this FV over FM declines over time, and the point at which one gets a 50% decline relative to the maximum, that's termed T50. So there's a lot of interest in that as a kind of reference of at least leaf level thermotolerance. So what have we done then? So we've tried over recent years, this is really through different grants, to understand the spatial patterns in core climate sensitivity traits across the Amazon. So this is one figure here. This exemplifies the scale of the efforts. This is work led by Julia Tavares, but also with Carol Signori, strongly involved, and then I'll show some of her results. And so at different sites in the Amazon, 11 plots in total here, and these include some plots which we've teamed up with partners who've also contributed with pre-existing measurements. We've gone and measured key hydraulic traits. Those include xylem vulnerability curves, measured also non-structural carbohydrates, a host of other measurements across the dominant species in each of these plots. And those plots, they span really this significant precipitation range that we show here. So many of these results are still emerging. So today I'll focus really on the non-structural carbohydrate results because those have been published, and we'll wait for Julia to reveal what we've learned about the hydraulics results in due course. So we've tried to build on that by adding to these sites. This is work of Emma Doherty here, information on thermal traits as well. So try to get at temperature responses to photosynthesis, thermal tolerance assays by measuring these across a host of sites, including the same sites we've measured the hydraulic traits, but also including sites along a temperature gradient in the Andes too. And so what are the things that have come out of this, and what have we learned about these this work? This is work led by Carol Signori here, who was a PhD student at Unicampi with Rafael Oliveira, and a core member of the Tremor efforts, and she led these NSC analysis. So what emerged from that is, if we look at least in the wet season, these include measurements in leaves and also in branches in the wet and dry season, so the peak of the dry season as well. And if we look at the leaf NSC concentrations and the branch concentrations in the wet season, plots are lined up here in order of dry to wet. We actually don't find any real differences in total NSC concentrations, either in leaves or in branches, across species in these sites in the wet season. Suggests, which is in a way good news for modeling. If there is, it means less perhaps assumptions about how these differ across space, at least in these organs under unstressed conditions. The interesting story was really in what happens seasonally. So if we look at the components of the non-structural carbohydrates, we look at soluble sugars and starches, and we look at how those change seasonally, then interesting patterns do emerge. So some of the strong signatures we were finding was a strong relationship between site water status. This is a measure here of community-weighted midday water potential in the dry season, and a fraction of the total NSCs in the form of soluble sugars. And clearly in the drier sites across our gradients, ever increasing proportions of the total NSC were in the form of soluble sugars. If we look at it in terms of starch, for example, as well, so we can click something similar there. So if we look at very higher starch concentrations in more mesic sites, and in the drier sites, some evidence of real strong starch depletion in the dry season. But what was interesting, what I found very interesting about all of this, was the synchronicity across species. So if we look at, these are plotted here on a basis from dry to wet here. If we look at the dry sites, almost all of the species that we looked at exhibited this pattern of increasing, at least proportional, soluble sugar concentrations in the dry season. In the more mesic sites, that was more mixed. And similar patterns with the starch. What about the leaf thermotolerance then? This is figures here from Rakesh. These have been published on a kind of site level. The regional picture is still emerging. Rakesh Tiwari's PhD, he went to one of the hottest forests in the Amazon and tried to understand really just what the limits of thermal tolerance limits of different species there were. He performed these thermal tolerance assays on a number of different species in dominant species in forests, and wanted to know how close T50 was, at least, to the air temperatures that those species were experiencing. One of the things he found is that one looks, these are the distributions of T50, so these are the T5 is the initial point of decline of these curves. See that in terms of T50, at least, there's still a safe space there in terms of air temperature in relation to the T50s that were observed and the maximum air temperatures experienced. But the temperatures are being pushed into a regime that is such that those air temperatures are starting to approach these initial decline points of that curve. What this means, of course, is still something we have to think about and work out. Now, I'd like to mention this other study. This is a study from Igor Araujo in Unemachi, and he took this one step further because ultimately the thermal safety margins, they relate to the leaf temperatures and not the air temperatures. The leaf temperatures that are really important for determining physiological stress. So what Igor did is he performed more of these thermal tolerance assays in a number of plant species that are found across different environments in the Cerrado region, so closed forest Cerrado, also typical Cerrado. And what he also did was collected leaf temperature data in concurrently with his measurements. And one of the things he looked at here, there's a lot on in this graph, but the T50s in each of these different spaces, that's the first color line here. This is the air temperature, the maximum air temperature is the second one that's reached. The third bar there includes leaf temperatures in the present day. And you can see that when you start to factor in leaf temperatures that get higher than air temperatures on several occasions, those limits are approximated, at least in this very warm part of the Amazon, much more closely. And if we then have climate scenarios into the future, we might even get to the point where of exceeding those critical limits. So finally, I'll just wrap this up then, because I know I've been speaking for a long time, and just talk a little bit about implications here for modeling. So there's different ways we can look at this. So I mentioned DGVMs, another type of model are these trait-based forest simulators. This is one developed here, which we use in Leeds, developed really by Nikos Filas, and designed specifically for Amazon forest plots. So it's initialized with trait distributions that are measured in the field, trait distributions of leaf N, of leaf P, of wood density, and also with diameter distributions measured in the plot and parameterized very closely for Amazon forests. So we've taken that a little bit further here, and what with Michelle Johnson's work, and what Michelle has done here is that she's linked to TFS. So TFS initially read in 4 traits, leaf N, leaf P, wood density, and LMA, and allocated those to different individuals from a distribution of field data. And she's developed that to bring in hydraulic traits that we're measuring in the field. So the model now reads in hydraulic traits as well, and linked that to the Sperry et al. 2017 stomatal optimization model, whereby stomatoconductance is optimized such as to maximize the difference between photosynthetic gain and a hydraulic cost associated with increasing embolism risk. So some of the interesting things that she's done here, we've been able now to relate this to measurements from the field, from each of our different sites. These are models versus observations. And the model performs very well in relation to the kind of distribution of leaf water potential values that we measure in the field, or the minimum leaf water potential values in the dry season. And with that, been able to simulate plant hydraulic safety margins for individual plots and how those develop over time. She's also linked that to remote sensing inventory data, to forest plot inventory data, to scale up beyond the sites for which we actually had measurements. And that's a really powerful combination, because it allows us to start modeling over large scales on trends in hydraulic safety margins. And one of the things that emerges, at least from current analysis, I'd ask you not to recirculate this wildly because this still is in preparation, is that, again, the southern Amazon areas seem to be the areas where we've got more evidence of markedly declining hydraulic safety margins over time. So finishing off then, just I know I've vastly exceeded my time, and I apologize for that. But moving forward, how do we place this all in the context of future directions and where we go from here? And I think the first thing to say is that we need to keep monitoring. We need to keep monitoring, and it's great. We've got great new satellites coming out. This is a JEDI satellite that provide new spatial cover over unprecedented scales. But it's the forest plot measurements, those measurements of how forests have been changing over time, those low-tech measurements that have really provided our insights in many ways into what we know about the forests. We need to add high-tech elements to those. Those can be at mesoscale, using drones, for example, as an example here of a thermal image, and large-scale remote sensing. But it's that combination of approaches that I think is really exciting for the future. Another thing is, of course, the linkages across scales. So our information's in a way still a little bit part. We have informations what happens at the leaf level, but it's linking those now to larger scale tree processes, individual scale tree processes, and ecosystem scale processes is really the challenge. And I mentioned this at the beginning, but I'll mention it now, is adaptive capacity. There isn't much known about adaptive capacity of Amazon forests in relation to climate stressors, whether that's temperature or drought. This is a very good study here from Paulo Bittencourt that examines this is based in a Kashiwana experiment that focuses on the control plot versus a droughted plot 15 years or something like that after the initial part of the drought, and found very little evidence overall of any kind of acclimation response in terms of the hydraulic properties that were measured in response to the drought. Finally, the configuration of the Amazon is changing. So we've got more and more secondary forests over time. Those are an important contributor to overall forest loss in the region. But we don't really know much about their vulnerability to climate change. In conclusion, Amazon forests are not all the same. They differ in background climate, soils, species composition, and that can affect their sensitivity to climate change. There's converging evidence really that forests in the southern Amazon face the greatest climate risk. And our knowledge really of Amazon forest climate sensitivity is still bit part. Continued monitoring, both low tech and high tech, is really imperative here. And with that, I'll stop and say thank you to all of those who've listened.
Thanks a lot, David. Thank you for the amazing talk. Still digesting here so much information. And I think everyone who has questions, please add the questions to the Q&A session. And we're going to start now with the questions to David. We have a question for Alex Mensah, that it's about how much does biotic factors, pests and diseases contribute to Amazon forest dieback? And do the dieback rates differ between plantations and natural forests?
Hi, Adriani. I missed the second part. I heard the pest and disease bit, so I can answer that, but you cut out for the second bit. Shall I answer the pest and disease bit first?
I can ask the whole thing. So the second part is if it rates dieback rates differ from between plantation and natural forests.
Okay. So yes. So the first one is on pests. No, and what a great question that is. And I think it's if you think about patterns, there's a couple of things to think about here when we think of mortality in the Amazon and in these forests as well. And Adriani knows this very well, is when you look at these changes in mortality over time in Amazon forests, at least you don't get these obvious signs of large-scale dieback in the field that you get in perhaps some of the more temperate forests, especially in the dry fringes of the US, where they've been well documented. The changes over time in mortality that we report, they're quite small. They might be a change, for example, from 2% mortality of the trees in a given year to 2.5% or 3% or what have you decades later. And so I think that's one thing to appreciate. And so actually cases in natural forests of large kind of beetle-induced dieback, they're just unheard of in a tropical forest, really, in Amazon forests. But that's not to say it's a great question still. And I would say that we actually don't know very much at all about how disease might be shaping or shape future mortality rates in tropical forests. It's an area where we have almost zero information. It's been much more studied, I think, in plantation contexts, where I think you have high concentrations of the same species in plantations, and maybe much higher concentrations of those pathogenic agents as well. On the question of risk to plantations versus natural systems, I think you'd almost expect. I think there's some very nice papers. I think back to Bill Anderegg's work linking hydraulic diversity in a plot, for example, to climate risk. And I think there's many strong reasons to believe that more diverse systems, they would be more resilient. There's more insurance built in through that higher biodiversity. So I would expect natural systems to be more resistant.
Yeah, I think that's a big unknown, the biotic thing in the tropics. So it's a very good question indeed. I'll open now for Bernhard actually to ask a question. Bernhard, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Impressive talk. I highly enjoyed it. You showed that the maximum climatic water deficit was related to the public safety margin, which I find impressive because you also, for your second hypothesis, you refer to the paper by Choate et al. From 2012. And in that paper, they kind of show that the hydraulic safety margin is very comparable across biomes. And you now show that at
so I think, yeah, I don't know if I think, are you referring to the modeling output?
It might be. I don't know. This is where you say do not Twitter.
Oh, that's the modeling output. So that's so what we show it. Actually, those are model results. So what we've done there is we've tried to simulate trends in hydraulic safety margins. So that's what we show there, and what the model, I guess the result there in the end is that those trends, they're most pronounced in those drier fringes of the biome. And perhaps when one looks at the climate space that the Amazon occupies, so if you think about the stressors in the initial part of the talk, so this is the area where there's clear evidence that it's getting drier and it's getting warmer. I think from that perspective, there's maybe a view, and I think Adriani's work, it gets to this point too. There's a signature there of, perhaps it was Adriani's point that the water deficit affiliation was a predictor of of mortality in the dry regions, but not in the wet. And there's different ways one can interpret that. And it might well suggest that in these regions, yes, I think you're absolutely right. I think over large scales and evolutionary timescales and at equilibrium, plants are adapted to their background climate and water availability. But there might be suggestions there that in these regions, which are ecotonal regions, drying very quickly, warming very quickly, they might now being pushed into areas that are beyond those adaptation limits. No? So,
Great, thanks, David. A few questions, maybe one more methodological question is it's from Yupeng Lu. So how does SIF quality in the Amazon with lots of cloud coverage affect the interpretation of your results?
Yeah. So it's a good question. So I think as with remote sensing products, there are always uncertainties with a lot of these. So Max has focused really on the periods where there was good coverage. He's focused really on the peak of the drought anomaly, if you like, when he's looking at he's focused in this analysis. So he's just by the selection there, he's focused on the driest this period, but also he's used products. He's been very careful in the choice of products, the SIF products he's chosen. He's used a product that, for example, where there's been specific efforts, I think, to correct for any kind of degradation effects or what have you that might be present in sensors. So it's a great question, I think we've done our best to deal with those effects in that analysis.
Thanks, David. So on to another methodological question again. Yeah, given the difficulty to reliably measure, this is from Camille Ziegler. Given the difficulty to reliably measure xylem vulnerability to embolism, would your network focus on residual water losses, G-mean, to study mortality mechanisms? It's apparently a relevant trait and easy to measure.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's a brilliant suggestion. It's not something we've actually measured in our trait campaigns thus far or thought about. We have focused on other metrics as well that are of interest. Leaf turgor loss points, for example. But I think it's definitely something we can consider. But thus far, it's not something we've addressed. No. Focus has been very much on vulnerability curves, some non-structural carbohydrates, and perhaps turgor loss points as well.
Thanks, David. I think we are running out of time and we will finish it now. But I just want to thank you again, David, for the amazing talk. I think everyone here learned a lot. We had a lot of questions still, and I tried to pass them over to you, but because of time here, we have to stop really. We will now have a Northern Hemisphere summer break. So okay. We will resume again later in the year in autumn. But thank you very much, David, and thank you everyone that watched. It was really, really a nice talk and really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.